Again, this is the data sharing agreements session, another level of partnership. Welcome. Let's go ahead and get this cleaned.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
Oh, okay, so now that we've gotten this cleaned, let's move ahead. Aloha, I'm Oleni. I will be doing some of the facilitation today. I'm joined by Tracy and Sarah as well. We're all part of your TA team. So welcome everyone today. If you want to go ahead in the chat and just put in where you're calling it or where you're zooming in from, that'd be great. Tracy will be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, please go ahead and note them there. When we do take sort of a breather, we will make sure we address those questions. We've got a lot of content to go through, and we're really excited to share that with you today. So for today, our session objectives are first to really explore purposes for data sharing amongst organizations. Then we're going to dig into FERPA and its impacts on data sharing, as well as look at examining critical components of data sharing agreements. Before we get into sort of the meat, we're going to be throwing around terms, and so we wanted to sort of identify some key terms for you folks. One of them is, you might see it's PII, it's abbreviated as PII. It's personally identifiable information. And in general, it means any direct identifier, such as a name, address, social security number. Also, indirect identifiers can be a responsible person, maybe in the school or in the school community, that may be able to take what information is there and identify it to a particular student. So there are both direct and indirect data or identifiers, sorry. And then there is FERPA. Just in case you didn't know, that stands for Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It's actually a federal act that all people who have individual student identified information are held to. Then there are educational records. And so in this specific instance, when we're talking about educational records, we are referring to records that are directly related to a student and maintained by an educational agency or institution, or by a party acting for the education agency or institution. Now, I know sometimes we throw around the term educational records, but in our conversation today, this is the definition, and that's what those, when we say that term, this is what we're referring to. And then we have SEAs, which are state education agencies, and LEAs, local education agency. And then there are CBO, and which are community-based organizations. Now, this term is going to really come into play as we talk about FERPA and get into sort of maybe how your organization best relates and identifies in FERPA. And so while many of you may be a TEA or even a tribal organization, you might be more aligned as a community-based organization as it relates to FERPA. Okay, so just wanted to sort of throw that out to you folks. So we're going to take a little poll right now just to sort of get a sense about where everyone is at. Really, the question is, where are you with data sharing? So maybe you have extensive experience as it relates to partnering with others and being able to both create and share data between organizations. Or maybe you just have some experience, maybe between one organization and are looking to develop more. You've tried to data share with other organizations but haven't been successful. So maybe you've created an agreement, but it hasn't sort of grown any feet, and then nothing's really happening with it. Or you've never tried to engage in data sharing. You're just sort of utilizing the data you currently have. So there's the poll, it's popping up. Okay, let's take, oh, we got lots of people who have tried. Most of us are looking like we have some experience with data. Awesome. Thanks for sharing, you guys. So let's move on to our next slide. So these are some of the uses for when we get into data sharing. So, and this can be the data that we would use could run either from program evaluation all the way to public reporting. Program evaluation is really where you're collecting data and in particular, maybe student learning data to really understand the progress your program is doing, what its strengths and weaknesses are at the programmatic level. Also, we also collect data from a variety of sources when we're thinking about prioritizing. This can come into play if you are maybe going through accreditation or through a strategic plan. You want to look at, all different types of data sets that are out there in order to really understand the needs and so that you can prioritize your strategies moving forward. And then service coordination. That really comes to play when you are thinking about maybe case management services, when you are working with other organizations around a particular student or maybe even a particular family. And you are needing to share that information and that data among various providers. And then similarly, there are partner sharing uses, and sometimes that comes into play with maybe you're collaborating with a partner, again around program services. So maybe you provide after school program, but you're working with maybe a tutoring program, and so that might be a way that you are sharing data between maybe like Sylvan and your organization that is looking at maybe SAT scores or wanting to support the student even more. It can also, partner sharing also comes to play if you are working in a collective impact setting. Maybe your community has a collective impact project going on. That's another way in which partners can share data. And then, of course, some of the more traditional ways of data is around research and policy. So utilizing data for research. So, for example, a lot of the programs you are doing are very like innovative, and maybe you want to sort of document its successes and where you've been able to make some real progress, maybe with academics, and you want to identify your program strategy as a best practice. That may be a way you could utilize data to sort of inform your description and identifying your strategy as a best practice. And then also in the policy arena, I don't know how many of you folks play in policy, but let's say you find as a best practice that immersion learning from pre-K through third really impacts the English language acquisition and literacy at the fourth grade. You've done a best practice research. You want to use that to maybe inform policy. Is that, you know, here, I'll take a wild and crazy stab. All grades, pre-K through four within a tribal should be immersion in order to get for fourth grade strong language English language acquisition. That's just an example of how you can take the data that you're collecting already and turn it into both research and policy. And then, of course, public reporting, which I know a lot of you folks do, whether it's reporting to funders or even maybe collecting the data and creating a dashboard for your organization, really showing the impact that you are making and sharing that, whether it's on your website or maybe even in your annual reports that share out with community and stakeholders. So a variety of ways that you can use shared data. So right now a poll is popping up. Oh, I see we have it already. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Sorry. A new poll should be popping up regarding which of these uses you most frequently use. There it is. So again, program evaluation, oh, service coordination, great. Prioritizing. Yeah, I know we use a lot of data when it comes to thinking about our strategic priorities and public reporting. Program evaluation, yeah. Awesome. So it looks like a lot of us are using, primarily use the shared data as for program evaluation, which is really important. And it has trickle down effects into all the other uses as well. Great. Thank you for sharing. So before we get into like the data world of everything, um, excuse me. Usually, before you start to collect data, you usually want to think about, you usually have a essential question that you're really trying to answer prior to even thinking about the data pieces. And so, oh, sorry. Um, and so we have in your landscape, you have a variety of stakeholders, and they all have different types of essential questions. So, for example, a funder, primarily most of their questions are related to, their return on investment, and if the investment they made is actually having the intended impact they have. I have some examples posted here on each area. More related to sort of the programs that you folks deliver. So, for example, under funders, maybe they are looking at what is the societal benefit of maintaining native language and culture. Maybe they're a large foundation and they want to sort of understand what impact, what are the societal benefits, maybe even beyond the native community as far as preserving and maintaining native language and culture. And then at the organization level, most organization essential questions really want to look at and understand and identify community met and unmet needs. Again, that helps drive sort of the organization, maybe strategic uh, priorities. It also impacts the overall organization's performance indicators. If you're really trying to focus on developing partnerships, maybe you are looking at how your success can increase partners and funding. As well as at the organization level, maybe an essential question could be how do native language programs impact academic achievement? Again, a real sort of broad, essential question. Um, and then at the program level, you're getting a little bit more into the nitty gritty, really trying to understand your program and your strategies and whether or not it's effective or not. And if you are also finding gaps in your program services. Sometimes you get a program running and you realize, wow, we're really doing good on this, but there's this whole other need we didn't know until we got into the midst of the program. And so maybe that's a gap that we need to look at. And so here are some potential essential questions at the program level, like what strategies are increasing culture and language proficiencies, as well as how are language and cultural practices impacting other areas of learning. And then again, we get down more connected to the actual participant, whether you're a teacher in a classroom, an instructor, or maybe even a program person providing after school. This is really you are getting like the daily moment to moment data come being thrown at you and experiencing. And so really what your data and your essential questions, sorry, might be really focused on is what strategies will increase an individual student's language and cultural proficiencies. And so you may be trying different strategies in your classroom to increase, let's just say, language proficiency around vocabulary. And you are seeing that maybe one strategy is working really well. Maybe like active learning, like getting up and actively showing the vocabulary words, really works well with students memorizing vocabulary. And so you want to take that sort of and move that through your program. The other thing I think a lot of teachers and instructors, essential question could be is where are the gaps in understanding with my students as it relates to language and cultural practices. And so again, that's the more sort of closer to the student essential question. And so what I wanted to do is we're going to do a little annotate and answer this question. Oops, wait, sorry, wrong one. Let me go back. There we go. And so if you don't know, if you go up to on your Zoom screen, you can go up to where it says Olani is sharing screen. If you folks all see that, menu should pop down. If you scroll over, either it'll be like a pencil and it'll say annotate. You can click there. If it's that icon is not showing up, you might want to go to the more button and click on more and look for annotate and then click on there. And then that will allow you to go ahead and type in to this actual screen. And if you could just really um, quickly write an essential question that you're most interested in within your either your program, maybe it's your classroom, program, or organization. I see you folks are all popping in. If you are having difficulty finding the annotate button, you can go ahead and put that in the chat. And then Tracy, could you let me know if there's lots of people that are having a hard time? How many books? Oh, nice. I love that. Motivating factors which contribute to Native scholars persisting in graduate programs. That's a really good one. How many books are in your home? Yep. I see one partial. It says, "How have our student?" And then I can't get through. Shucks. Allison, if you just want to click off of mute, you could go ahead and just maybe share that.
I was going to type, how have our student support services affected absenteeism?
Oh,
Sorry, I'm
oh,
sick.
oh, I'm sorry. Your voice. Hope you didn't strain your voice too much. Yeah, that's a really good one. How to incorporate. Okay, I'm gonna wait one more sec to see if anybody else. How can we systemize data sharing for serving students in schools with tribal program coordinators in schools? Okay, that's really good. That's a seems like a organization. How many students are still teaching? Nice. That sounds like a PD question. How do A services affect suspensions or tardies? Good one. How are our native programs being implemented in our schools? Yeah, that's a really good one. That could be both, program organization and also funder potentially, um, to really see the depth in which those programs are being implemented. Awesome. Really great questions. So really, again, when we talk about data sharing, we're not just collecting data to collect data, right? There's a question we are looking for answers for. And so these are some really great questions. Oh, what state partnerships are most successful to support the needs of our students? Oh, that's a good one, right? I mean, that finding that data and tracking that data could really, again, lead to some really good research and maybe even some policy development. How how do you address data sovereignty with tribal entities? Yeah, there I think is a big question as it relates to data sharing, right, between tribal entities, amongst tribal entities, and then amongst state education agencies. Awesome. Thank you guys for participating. Really great question. So, again, we start with the essential question and then we build off of that. I'm going to go ahead and erase all of these great questions. I'm kind of bummed, but let's go ahead. We caught it on video, so we can go back and look at it. And then we're going to move on. Oh, it's not letting me erase. Sorry. Uh, okay, there we go. Thank you. All right, let's move forward. Oh, okay. All right. So once we start asking our questions and coming up with our essential questions, the next thing we sort of want to look at is where are the answers, right? And so one of the places we go to is uh, our, I want to say, you know, regular, sort of normal, traditional data sources. And why I want to say, I say traditional in the sense that that's what we think about data. But really, I think when we think about data as Native people, and I think what other people are coming to understand is that, you know, the experience of people is actually a really important data aspect. And so these are just sort of number crunching pieces of data. You really want to get into the qualitative. And so these are different sources. We have the national, at the national level. We have sources that sort of collect a broad set of data around, you know, basically nationally. We also have at the state level, we have data. Normally, those are found in like state departments, particularly SEAs and state educational agencies, as well as local data. And so you may have, again, maybe some United Way has local data more specific to maybe your either your city or your town. Also, you know, with the tribal, your nations as well as your TEAs, those may also have sets of data. And then there's also data hubs. And data hub is really a collection of data from multiple sources organized for distribution and sharing. And so the benefit of a lot of these data sources is that they've already collected the data and sort of been able to analyze it and then be able to sort of is to share it out in a way that is easily digestible. And so I'm going to share with you just a few of these sources that I thought were interesting and that I had never seen. And maybe you folks are well acquainted with these data sources. Let me. Okay, so can you see this big map? You guys can all see it? Okay, so this is a national level data source. And I really like this because again, it's primarily focused on economics and prosperity. But if you look at how you can search, you can actually go here and find tribal areas, which I didn't find too many resources that actually pulled out tribal areas. And so you can click here, you can come here and choose, you know, different prosperity areas, and then be able to sort that and look deep into some of this data and see it more local, but on a national level, which I thought was pretty cool. Um, in particular because it has data. And then at the state level, this is an example. This is Alaska, and they have many of your states. Uh, Educational agencies have data uh, storing areas and able for you to access that. And so you can look at all different reports on different state websites and be able to really sort of dig into the data at your state level. Just in case you didn't know that existed, most states have because most need to report the data. And then this is what I would consider is a data hub. Now, I know most of us probably, when we probably Google in education when we're looking for data. But also, you know, when you're thinking about different areas and the effects, things that can affect data, for example, economics or even health, you might want to look outside of the educational arena and look at other areas. And so this one is Rural Health Information Hub. And so they pull data again nationally, but you're able to look at more rural areas, which can be helpful because a lot of times, you know, rural data gets skewed into urban and it gets all blown out and you can't really you can't really see too much. So that's just sort of three resources that are available, and there's a lot out there. In Hawaii, we say there's choke out there. That means there's a lot. um, And so let's go back to our presentation. Okay, so we've developed our essential question. We've looked at some broad areas of data, and now we want to look more at how do we pursue maybe individual student data for the students that we're actually working with. Well, one of the ways to here are some steps and we're going to be going over for successful data sharing. One of the things that's very key is to build trust. And I saw this great sort of like tagline, capacity, I mean, data sharing grows at the speed of trust, which I think is really, really resonates with building trust. And so here are different ways in which you can build trust. Understanding FERPA, being educated about FERPA, drafting really sound written agreements, ensuring adequate data infrastructure, and then investing in your team. These are all steps that can help lead to successful data sharing. And so, how do we build trust? There are multiple steps, and I know you folks are involved in this on a daily basis. One is to build community credibility, another is to identify shared benefits, also to define privacy and security measures, and then really thinking about equity in data. So, we're going to dive into all of these areas a little bit more. Okay. All right, so this is going to be a little activity that we're going to do. Either you can jot this down on your notes or just think about it in your head. A lot of times when we think about establishing community credibility, we think about it in terms of us going out and doing that work and developing these partnerships. Well, sometimes when you are doing a like maybe I want to say like a cold call, maybe you have a particular partner you'd like to connect with, but you have no like real connection to them. One thing is about think looking and identifying credibility advocates. And so let's go through a little exercise on how we could go about doing that. So right now, I want you to think of three current partners you are currently working with that have been really sort of positive partnerships. And maybe, as you're thinking about them, maybe this might be, a partnership that's been going on a long time, or maybe it's something that's just been developing over a short amount of time. So maybe just get three people in your mind, or you can jot them down on a piece of paper. Once you have that, look at that list of three and really identify the one advocate that would be perfect to be your advocate on this potential cold call to a partner that you'd like to share or get data from. Um, think about them in terms of like what makes them a perfect advocate. Maybe they really understand and know your program. They've had definitely a positive relationship with your organization. Maybe they're able to talk about how your program and the sharing of data maybe with each other has really helped them to build their program, and so they have actually seen a benefit for themselves. So if you've been able to identify one person that could really speak for you, now I want you to think about that one person and what is their sphere of influence? Are they in their sphere of influence? Do they connect to any potential partners that you would like to get connected to, but currently do not have a connection? So maybe they're at the community college or the tribal college, but maybe they sit on a board that brings together all sort of sectors of the K through post secondary education, and so that therefore they're sitting in the room with the actual superintendent. Maybe you don't know this. If you don't know this, it might be interesting to talk to this potential advocate. What is their sphere of influence, and get to understand that and see if there is a connection to. And the reason why I'm asking you to think about all of these things is because sometimes, when you're going someplace, a cold call can be just that. It's a cold call. But if you have an advocate who already has a relationship with that potential partner and has a strong relationship, they could be the door opener for you to get into this. And so you're walking in under their coattails of credibility already. So whether it's setting up a session, maybe a time, a meeting, sometimes it could be a simple email introduction to maybe the holder of the data or the person who grants permission for data sharing agreements. It could be actually them going and advocating in an actual meeting. If that's the case, you really want to make sure that your credibility advocate is prepared to advocate on your behalf. And so really understanding like why you want to build this partnership, and what are the benefits for both your organization as well as the the potential partner. It really helps, I think, if you are trying to build relationships and there's not one there, to really go in with somebody who already has that path laid down and probably has a really great um, relationship with a potential partner. That's one way to build credibility pretty fast, and really help move you forward. Another one is to identify shared beliefs with your potential data sharing partner. Really think taking a moment before you go into a meeting and ask for permission for shared data, to think about what's in it for them. Really having to answer that question really prepares you for that discussion. Also, being transparent and transparent with maybe sharing other agreements that you've had, and how you've used that data. Again, that's another way to bring in credibility. Like, let's say, for example, maybe you are working with, oh, I don't know, maybe you're working with the university at the university level and you already have a sharing agreement and you've been able to collect data, and that has really you know had an impact in providing services to the university. Share that agreement with the potential partner and really share how you were able to work with that organization. Also, a great thing that is, I think, is a low cost sort of way. If there is work that you're already doing, how you can sort of fold the potential partner in. Um, they call it value added. And so if your partner is sort of like struggling in an area, maybe to analyze the data, and you have the ability to do, offering that service for the data and then giving them back that analyzed data could be a potential, what's in it for me, and answering that question for them. And then when we get to what's really key, and I'm sure most of you are sort of coming up to this as you have data sharing, and try to engage in data sharing agreements, is really to define your own privacy and security measures, to get really clear with those, and to share first your specific needs and intentions for the shared data. Invite partners to participate on a data sharing advisory group. Now, if you can do that before you even ask for data, you really get a lot of insight into their concerns regarding data, and you can engage them in actually solving their problems for themselves in order to get and allow them to share data with you. So including your potential partners as it relates to wanting to get data from on an advisory group is really helpful. Um, you want to make sure your data security includes these elements: policy and governance. And so, not just the other thing is, if you're not just talking about it, you actually have a written policy and governance process. Also, personnel security, sorry. Um, Wanting to make sure, like identifying who has access and how you're securing that they have secured access. Also, another key piece I saw in one state agreement was the state actually had an annual training, data security training that all partners had to go through. Well, maybe your state doesn't have that. You might want to institute that within your own organization because it's just helpful to keep up to date on, FERPA changes and any state or local agency or even tribal changes to security, and incorporate that into your processes, and put that up front, because then that reassures your potential partner that you are always keeping up to date with information and keeping your staff up to date. Physical security. So if you're printing out information or you have tests or assessments that you're collecting, where are you securing them? I know when we had accreditation, we had to have locked drawers in a locked room, and where were the keys held? Really sort of getting to that minuteness. Mobile devices. Are people able to access your data warehouse or your data information off of their own personal, or are they only able to access off of work uh, devices? And then are they required to go through a VPN? So again, looking at and articulating those processes. Um, are you allowed to email confidential data? Um, that's a kind of iffy one. And if so, what are the strong security processes you have in place to make sure that that doesn't go to the wrong person or can be hacked into? And then, if there is a breach in the data, how do you handle that? Who gets informed? How are you notifying those people of the breach, and how are you going to either recover or secure or destroy any other remaining information? And then also providing some audit and compliance monitoring. And so, what does that mean as far as within your own organization, as well as sometimes when you get into actually creating the agreements, an organization may want to put in a clause that they can come and audit your own processes and policies. So then we really want to get into thinking about equity. And I know within the Native community, we are very aware of equity as it relates to, our Native students. And so really, when you are thinking about your data work, really centering equity in that work, we want to also expand the meaning of data beyond just standardized test scores. And so, again, this gets back to the security part. If you are doing surveys or you're collecting qualitative information, that's actual data that needs to be secured, particularly if there is a name attached to it or any kind of identifier, whether it's direct or indirect. And then we want to use data responsibly. A lot of data uh, has been used to the detriment of Native communities. And so, really thinking about taking a more asset based approach as it relates to reporting out data. Not to, sugarcoat any of the data that we really need to get to, but to provide a more balanced approach, and not forgetting all the assets, and collecting that asset based data, as well as use data. Okay, I said that already. Sorry. So that's really part of the part we want to think about equity, even within Native communities, and not it's not when we talk about equity, we're not just talking about race or ethnicity or we're talking all different types of equity and identification. So now we're going to get into the fun stuff around FERPA and the world of FERPA. But before we get there, we wanted to sort of see where you folks are. Are you a FERPA pro? Have you worked with FERPA and kind of understand it, but I still find it kind of confusing? Um, do you know about FERPA in general, but haven't like gotten into work with it often, or you're like, who is FERPA? It says what, but I think who is FERPA. It's funnier. Anyway, so let's see where everybody's at. Oh, we got some pros, some FERPA pros. Awesome. Worked with FERPA. Okay, Great. Looks like a lot of us know about FERPA in general, but don't work with it often. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. Um, so again, we got most of us, we know about FERPA in general, but not sort of haven't worked with it regularly. And then some, we know about it, but we still find it confusing. Okay, so let's get in. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Um, let's get in. We have a little, oh, where is it? And let's just see if it plays. Okay, one moment. Okay. Let me see. I'm going to try and. Hmm, have you guys seen anything? Sorry. Hmm. Let me stop share and I will try to go back. Hi, everybody.
Alani, do you want me to share the video?
Yeah, could you please? Sorry, I might not be on it.
The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA, is a federal law which applies to educational institutions and agencies, such as schools, school districts, colleges, and universities, to which funds have been available under any program administered by the Secretary of Education. The purpose of FERPA is to protect the privacy of parents and students with regard to education records under Section 444 of the General Education Provisions Act as amended. Wow, it's easy to get confused with all that legal language. Let's try that again in plain English. The truth is, data about us is everywhere. It's collected when we shop, take a vacation, look at a web page, or send an email. You see, FERPA is a federal law that applies to most schools, colleges, and universities. It's meant to protect all that identifiable information about students in records that are kept by schools, and it provides the right for you to access that information, to seek to correct it, and generally to consent to its disclosure. Let's take a closer look at what that means. Today is Patrick's first day of kindergarten. As Patrick moves through the education system, his schools accumulate data, such as his grades, learning disabilities, or special needs information, and disciplinary information. As Patrick takes tests to see how he's progressing, his scores are protected by FERPA. FERPA requires schools and state and local educational agencies to keep the information that came from Patrick's records private and get his parents' written consent before sharing it with anyone else. There are some exceptions, but the general rule is Patrick's records are confidential. Students don't attend school anonymously, so schools routinely share some basic information about students called directory information. If a school is going to share directory information, it must notify parents and students who are 18 or over or who attend post-secondary institutions. For example, Patrick's school yearbook contains his name, grade level, and photograph. That's okay because his school designated these items as directory information and published its policy on its website, and Patrick's parents haven't opted out. FERPA also requires schools provide Patrick's parents the ability to review his records to make sure they are accurate. Patrick's applying to college. He and his parents review his high school transcript and discover the school has gotten Patrick confused with another student who has lower grades. This isn't good. FERPA not only gives his parents the right to see the records, but also to request that the school correct mistakes. If Patrick's parents and the school disagree on the accuracy of the info, FERPA gives Patrick's parents the right to request a hearing. Colleges and universities are also required to protect student information under FERPA, but the rules change a bit. Meet Lisa, a high school graduate who is headed off to college. Hooray! While Lisa was in elementary, middle, and high school and under the age of 18, FERPA allowed her parents access to her education records. Now, Lisa is entering college, and her FERPA rights transfer from her parents to her. Her parents wonder, but wait a minute, I'm paying the bills here, and now I can't see how she's doing academically? Since Lisa's parents claim her as a dependent on their federal tax return, her parents can still see her education records if Lisa's college chooses to release them. FERPA doesn't require schools to release records, it only allows this. You may be wondering, how do I find out more about how FERPA affects me or my child? To start, look for your school or school district's FERPA policy on its website, or ask your principal or school administrative staff about your rights under FERPA. Visit the Department of Education's Family Policy Compliance Office website for answers to frequently asked questions on privacy, training, and guidance for parents and students on FERPA rights and protections. The Family Education.
All right, so I'll be joining you to talk about FERPA. So I always get the fun part of the presentation. So I'm guessing a lot of you, when that last video started, panicked. That was what it was like when I first started watching the video, because it starts running through all this information, which is kind of what it feels like reading through FERPA. Even though I can read through it at whatever pace I'd like, it feels a lot like the beginning of that video where you're just being inundated with information and legalese. And we're not going to go into every single aspect of FERPA because we have 90 minutes and because I don't want you to disconnect from the webinar. But we are going to go into a few key components that I think can help you when you're trying to do data sharing. And in particular, when you're trying to do data sharing with whether it be a school, an LEA, a local education agency like a school district, or even your SEA, your state education agency. So in particular, we're going to be talking about written consent, de-identified data, and exceptions to written consent, which I know is sometimes where we're trying to go and get hung up. So one important thing that I want to talk about just kind of right off the bat is that FERPA doesn't actually address data sharing, which may really come as a surprise to a lot of you who have repeatedly heard from the entity you're trying to data share with, well, I can't share data with you, FERPA. And they just use it like a big stop sign to the data. And so you assume FERPA must have all of this rule and regulation in it about data sharing. It doesn't. And the reason for that is because FERPA is a privacy and confidentiality statute. It's all about access to student information. So when we're talking about data sharing under FERPA, the term used under the statute and in the regulations is really about disclosure of PII, that personally identifiable information from education records. But it doesn't actually get into the weeds of who you can share with, how you can share, what sharing is allowed and what sharing, isn't. It does get into, though, under what circumstances PII can be disclosed in general. So that's where we're going to kind of lean with this. It is still going to be a lot of information. So as we're going through, if you have questions, make sure and pop those in the chat box so that we can try to address as many as possible. So we'll start where I know a lot of you already are, which is written consent. So this is when a parent or an eligible student, so that student who's 18 and now in charge of their own records, can provide a signed and dated written consent to allow for PII disclosure. Now, some of you have been able to do this. You get these written consents and then you're able to give them to the entity, and then you're able to access that data. So a couple of pieces on that. One, that written consent can be something that was developed by, say, the school district, and the parent or student completes it, and then they're able to share with you. It could be a written consent that's created by your organization. But the bottom line is, ultimately, it's up to the organization that holds the data, so in this example, the school district, to determine if the written consent is sufficient and they're going to share the data. So that means that even if you've created what would be a wonderful written consent form, it's all about that relationship that you've then built with that entity and them accepting that form. Now, the things that FERPA tells us the written consent does have to include in order for it to be adequate is exactly what education records are going to be disclosed. So exactly what information you'd like from the district, the purpose of that disclosure. So why do you need it? What are you going to do with it? And the organization or other parties to whom the disclosure may be made. So, of course, designating your entity as receiving that information. But again, the organization that you're asking for data from, the school district or whomever, may require additional information be in that written consent. These are just the only parts that are required according to FERPA. But you may have other state regulations or local regulations that would require you to have additional information in your written consent. If this is something you can work out and you and the other organization agree on this written consent form, it's something that could be included in a registration packet for your services and kind of routinely filled out as students enroll. That may be the easiest way to handle that. And a lot of times, this is how a lot of us are able to access the data, is by going through some sort of written consent process like this. But there are some other methods. The next one we're going to look at is de-identified data. So for the de-identified data, schools technically do not have to obtain written consent or even inform parents and eligible students when they release properly de-identified information. Now, you've probably all seen some information like this, like when the school district reports out either touting or lamenting the standardized test scores for the year. And they're typically very broad. Third graders did this on reading, fourth graders did this on math. So there's no way that you could identify a specific student did something or even a particular teacher's class. That's properly de-identified information. By and large, though, that's probably not the data that you're trying to get to actually use in informing your programs and services. But just know that that de-identified data should be available and out there. That a lot of times is also what you would get on some of the data sources that Alani was sharing earlier. If you go to the data hubs or the state report cards or the school report cards, definitely a great starting place and does give you some information, but it's always going to be at that higher level. Okay, so just some caveats with all of these. The other thing to think about is that, unfortunately, the nature of the data that we often seek for our programs doesn't always get released with this de-identified information. So for instance, if you're trying to get information from a school that is located on the reservation that you serve and is a primarily Native student serving school, then that de-identified large-scale information is going to tell you a bit more about the students you're serving. But if you're reaching out to maybe an urban school district that has a relatively small Native student population, then a lot of times you end up seeing little asterisks and notes saying, well, the sample size was too small, so we've had to mask that data. And so you end up, even though they're releasing the information in general, it doesn't actually tell you a single thing about your kids. So that's some things that you're going to run into with that de-identified data, particularly if you're then requesting it from an entity that is serving a smaller portion of Native students. So little bits and pieces there. Now, the next part is what I think will be possibly some new information or slightly more illuminating information, I hope, for you. And it's the 3 exceptions to written consent. So we know about written consent and what you would have to do in order to access data that way. But there are 3 ways that an entity, again, in our example, a school district, could release data to you without express written consent. And that's a school official exception, a studies exception, or an evaluation audit exception. So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on all 3 of these. Some of them are a little bit complex, so know that we're going to cover them to a certain depth, but we'll give you some resources to, if you think that might work for you, dive into them further. So the first one is a studies exception.
So this would be that you're going to qualify because what you're doing with that data would constitute conducting a study for or on behalf of the school or the LEA. So under that studies exception, they can release PII to you only if you meet these things. The study has to be conducted in a manner that does not permit the PII of parents and students by individuals other than representatives of the organization that have legitimate interest in the information. So you would have to be very specific about who within your organization would have access to that data. The information would have to be destroyed when it's no longer needed for the study. So you have to be able to prove that by a certain date, when this study is completed, that information will be destroyed. And it does require the school or LEA entering into a written agreement with your entity. It also limits the purpose of the studies. So you can develop, validate, or administer predictive tests, probably not as applicable. Administer student aid programs. Primarily, this is kind of referring to things like financial aid. So, you could maybe, depending upon if you're providing some sort of scholarship to students through the program, that may be a way in. Any of these are going to take, again, discussion with the district, because it is up to them to determine if you meet this exception and they move forward with that. Or the one that you would probably have the most success with would be improving instruction. That, through the data analysis, you're going to be assisting the district in also improving their instruction through deeper understanding of the students. So a written agreement does have to be completed for this. So you would have to enter into a written agreement with the district. And there are certain things that have to be included. Now, I want to make sure, everyone knows FERPA does not provide any templates. It does not provide any examples, but it does tell you certain components that would need to be in that written agreement. It would have to specify the purpose, scope, and duration of the study, and all the information that's going to be disclosed to you. So all the data pieces that you would receive. It would have to require you to use the PII from education records only to meet the purposes of the study as stated in the written agreement. And so really thinking about, your entity may work with these students in a multitude of ways, but you would only be able to use that information, that data that you gather, for what's expressly stated in the written agreement. And then after that, again, it would have to be destroyed. It would require the study to be conducted in a manner that's not going to permit the PII to go to anyone that doesn't have legitimate interest. So kind of a need to know basis. So again, really stipulating who within your organization. So thinking through, is it just the project director? Is it your evaluator? Who on your team is going to have access to that data to be able to complete this, and expressly stating that within the written agreement? And then again, that destruction clause, that would have to be in the actual written agreement as far as how it would be destroyed, when it would be destroyed, that part. Now, your written agreement would probably have a number of other things in it with the school district, but those are the only components that are required. So that's the studies exception. I will say, I don't see a ton of entities getting to do the studies exception, with the exception of, sometimes like actual large scale research studies, things that the district has kind of signed on for, but it is there. It is a possibility. The next one is your audit evaluation exception. This one, I apologize, the slides are a little wordier because it's a little more complicated. So for this one, before the local education agency, the school district, can disclose PII, it would have to designate you as an authorized representative. And then it's required to use, you can see, reasonable methods to ensure to the greatest extent practicable that the information is FERPA compliant. So this one really gets into, you're having to really show to the district that you can meet the same FERPA regulations that they do. So back when Alani was talking about some of those data privacy and security measures, being able to show that your organization is capable of meeting FERPA just as well as they are, that data is going to be safe with you. And you're going to have to be able to prove that to the district. Now, in all honesty, with any of these, you're probably going to have to be able to show that to the district in order for them to, in good faith, provide you with PII. But this one just stipulates it very heavily in their explanation. So what do they say that specifically means in regards to this exception? You would be using that PII to carry out an audit or evaluation, and here's the key part, of a federal or state-supported education program. So where this sometimes gets a little bit gray area is if you're just requesting all the information for all the students because you want to look at it across all the programs that you offer, probably isn't going to meet this. You're going to have to be much more specific, and it's going to have to be to audit or evaluate one of your federal or state supported education programs. So your OIE grants are federal supported, but again, it's going to be up to the district to determine whether that would count as an education program. And we'll get into a little bit of what education program kind of means in this world. But that's part of the key part, is it has to be a federal state supported education program. So basically a government supported education program. The district is required to make sure that the proposed audit or evaluation is legitimate, and that those education records, that PII that's being released, is only going to be used for that. It has to determine that you have methods in place to protect the PII from any other further disclosures or use other than this audit evaluation. And then, of course, another thing in here about destroy. So there's going to have to be, a discussion and documentation of exactly how that information will be destroyed when it's no longer needed or after a certain period of time. This also does require a written agreement. Same thing, there is not a specific template or anything, but it does have certain components it must have. It has to designate the authorized representative from your entity. It has to specify exactly what's going to be disclosed and for what purpose. And that's where it, again, has that note in there about a federal or state supported education program. It has to describe the activity to make it clear that it falls within the audit or evaluation exception. So you have to really describe exactly what you're going to be doing with that data. It has the destruction piece that has to be in the actual written agreement. And then the written agreement will also have to describe your policies and procedures that are consistent with FERPA. The last part of this is kind of a caveat that they include when they talk about this exception. So the caveat here is that the audit or evaluation by an organization of its own program, so to determine whether or not your program is effective, in most cases would not be permitted under the audit or evaluation exception, because it only permits the audit or evaluation of a federal or state supported education program. Now, here's what FERPA defines as an education program. It includes these, but is not limited to. So again, there's some room there, but it's all about what the district considers an education program. But typically it includes early childhood education. There are some examples of like data sharing with a Head Start program. Elementary and secondary education, post-secondary education, special education, job training. And I know a number of you do some job training, some career technical ed, adult education, or any program that's administered by an educational agency or institution. So you can see it doesn't get super specific. It leaves it just broad enough that it leaves the district some room to potentially include you as a federally supported education program or not. So again, kind of going back to that relationship building. So that's the second exception. The third exception is where I think you would have the most success. So I started with the most difficult to end on a high note exception. So the school official exception is the one where I think our programs would have the most likelihood of being successful in being able to access data without specific written consent. And this is when you would be performing an institutional service or function for which the agency or institution would otherwise use employees. So here are some ways that I think you could think about this in discussion with the district. Does your program provide tutoring, whether that be, say, SAT tutoring, math tutoring, something like that? That is often something that would be provided by the school district, by, say, a certified teacher or other district employee, a tutor that they hire. But likely you're providing it because they either don't have the funds or they don't have the staff. So you're providing something that could otherwise be provided by the district, but you've partnered together for you to provide that. It could also be, I know a number of you provide language classes that are actually offered during the instructional school day, often offered for credit. Same thing with some of your career and technical ed things. Those are things that the school district could, and in many instances would, provide through their own organization, through their own staff, but instead have partnered with you to be able to provide. So I think these are the types of things that would very easily fall within this school official exception. Is under the direct control of the agency or institution with respect to the use and maintenance of education records. So this just means that you're going to have to follow, those same policies. You're going to be subject to the same FERPA requirements. You're going to have to do all of that piece. Another interesting thing here is that a written agreement is not required for this one. It is highly recommended. And I would definitely recommend to all of you, don't go any of these routes without a written agreement, because handshake deals are very easy to go back on. A written agreement, while it won't necessarily guarantee that it can't be gone back on, holds a lot more weight and says from the get-go that everyone has the same understanding of what's going to occur. So even though the school official exception doesn't require a written agreement, I would definitely encourage you to always use a written agreement when setting up data sharing, particularly of this magnitude. Okay. Oh, and Allison brings up a good point that, not that superintendents ever turn over, but, if you have a written agreement in place, you're not starting from scratch every time there's turnover. There's a history there. And I see, there's been some discussion about particularly those first two exceptions being a little unwieldy. I agree. I don't know that those will necessarily be the easiest routes, but I do think that a number of you may find success under this school official exception. So just some thoughts there. So any questions on the exceptions that we've talked about? All right, keep mulling it over. You can pop that in the chat box as it comes up. I'm going to then move into written agreements. Now, as we talked about before, in some of these instances, they're required. So if you're going to be doing the audit evaluation exception, if you're going to be doing any of those others, then yes, you are going to need a written agreement. For some of the other ones, it's not required, always recommended. You can call it whatever you like. You can call it a data sharing agreement like we have throughout this webinar. You can call it a memorandum of understanding, a memorandum of agreement. You can call it a contract. The terminology honestly doesn't matter. It's just serving that same purpose. Please know that OIE does not have any required formats, any required templates, because data sharing is not a requirement of any of your projects. It's definitely needed, and it definitely is a big part of a lot of your projects, but because it's not something that OIE has mandated a certain way to do, there is not any type of required format or template. By the same token, there are no required formats or templates from FERPA. They do designate certain components that would be mandatory based on specific exceptions that you might be using. We do have some best practices, a number of which kind of go into things that are specific from FERPA. And we'll share a link with you to look at a document that actually goes into detail on some of the best practices on written agreements from FERPA. But in general, you want to make sure that this is something that is agreed to and binding with both parties, agrees to any limitations on your use of the PII. So you don't want it to be any misunderstanding of what you're going to be doing with that. You want it to specify exactly who the point of contact is for both organizations. Depending upon what you're going to be doing with it, you may have to look into an institutional review board. For the vast majority of you, with what you're doing with the data, that won't be applicable. It will want to think about who actually owns the PII. Typically, the agreement is going to state that the district maintains ownership of the PII, and you are merely using it until such time that you are required to destroy it. It will often identify penalties for inappropriate disclosure. So an example is, I've seen a situation where, let's say you as the grantee got the data, and then another organization in the community is working on the same goals or on a similar project. And so some of that information was shared because it would help them be able to do the same thing. They weren't even thinking about the fact that it was PII, but that's an inappropriate disclosure. You did not have permission to further disclose that information. And so often it will stipulate in that written agreement that if something like that happens, that you may be on kind of a data timeout for a certain amount of time. It'll set terms for that data destruction, include any funding terms. Typically, it'll just stipulate no one's paying for anything, that there's nothing monetary involved in this. And it will often stipulate that the district maintains the right to audit, to come in and see exactly how you're storing things. It goes into actually, typically putting in some pieces about how you're going to safeguard the data, how you're going to handle any type of data breach. Typically, that means you're going to inform the district within 24 to 48 hours, certain steps so that they understand that there has been a breach as well. It also is going to stipulate how you're going to actually report back results. So think about how you're going to transparently share the results of your data analysis. Sometimes this might include providing them with a copy of the final report, maybe an opportunity for them to review so that they can give you some feedback if they feel that any part of the report is sharing PII versus masking. It might actually hold you to some of the same things that they have, as far as if there's a certain group size of less than 10, it may ask that you also mask that data in your own reports. So these are all things to think about when you're thinking about that data. It will also typically specify the term of the agreement and when the data sharing will occur, whether you're going to get a big data dump annually, if it's something you're going to get every month, every semester, and for how long is this agreement good? Typically, I would say most are a year and then have to be re-signed. So just some general there. We do have a sample that we're going to share with you. And we'll pop that in the chat box, and you'll have, an opportunity to review that on your own time, because just looking at it on the screen, there's no way you're going to be able to process that whole sample and ask questions right away. So I want you to be able to take that, look through, and then touch back with questions on that. But keep in mind that it is a sample based on the school official exception, because we feel like that's the one that you're most likely to be successful under, and is one that we've seen other entities be able to do with school districts. But know that it's just that. It's a sample. It's not required in any way. You can modify it however you like to meet the needs of your organization or of the school district's needs. Do with it as you will. And unfortunately, even if you use it and really fill it out nicely, we can't guarantee that use of the sample will ensure that a district will actually data share. It's just to share some best practices and pieces that will actually work for other folks and hopefully will work for you as well. So I'm going to pop that in the chat box as I also switch over and let Alani take away the next part. Oh, Alani, I think you're on mute.
There I am. So thanks, Sarah, for making FERPA a little bit more understandable and bringing it, and going through it to help us understand what would work best for as you folks are community-based organizations. So let's get back into, again, how do we develop within our organizations to be successful data sharers and data receivers. One is really thinking about our data infrastructure. This has a lot to do with thinking about the tools we use to collect data from within partnerships. Also, where we're warehousing that data and storage tool is most of it is electronic, and then how we are preparing that data, how we're doing analyzation and also creating visualization. And then also looking at, again, like I said, the visualization, how are we communicating and disseminating out the findings that we have? Really sort of thinking through your data infrastructure. And also remember, potentially as part of your agreement, being able to articulate the different parts of that infrastructure. So really, when we think about data and how it flows through our organization, where we're thinking about our, the raw data collection, it comes in, maybe we have an agreement, then we're going to be getting all this data. It's coming electronically, or maybe we have to actually pick it up in some form or fashion, whether it's a external hard drive or another means, or getting access to their sort of back end of their data warehouse. Also, thinking about once we get the data, where are we warehousing it, and then what are we doing to process it, and then how do we access that and provide access to the data for anyone within our organization and even with our partner, and then how are we sharing those insights. And so a lot of those considerations are, who has access at each step, what do they have access to at each step, and what protocols are in place at each step of this flow through our organization. And then again, when we think about the data infrastructure, what hardware and or software is needed for each step. So like I said, when you think about the raw data collection, how are you receiving that data? It could be multiple ways, like I shared earlier. And then how do you take that data in whatever form it is and then store it within your organization? So really thinking through those different steps and articulating that out. The other area that really helps develop successful data sharing is really investing in your team. Really thinking about the people within your organization and who has access. So defining roles and responsibilities as it relates to data, as well as building data competency within your organization. So let's look at first defining roles and responsibilities. So if you had to choose of all the data roles that are out there and responsibilities, you don't have anyone doing that work right now, what you'd first like to look at is creating a data manager role and or responsibility. Now, mind you, this may be an actual position and a person, which would be great, but maybe you're in transition. And so maybe some of these roles and responsibilities have to be given to maybe the program director starting out, because maybe you haven't budgeted in an actual data manager right now. So, but you want to make sure if you are receiving data that you are putting some of these roles and responsibilities to someone who's going to be responsible. And so, again, these are some broad roles and responsibilities, really leading the data strategy for the organization, facilitating trust building, data landscape, and strategy. So that's really, would this person, if you had this person as a as a position would be going out and developing and maintaining the trust and relationships with your partners and potential partners. Also doing data collection and analyzing, communication and coaching, so whether that's internal and external, as well as translating data into action. And so, how are they preparing the data to then be delivered, to make sure that there's some action to that, whether it's informing classroom practices or even program strategies. Now, I know sometimes we have to get creative because maybe right now we can't afford an actual data manager. And so sometimes we have to look at other ways. So maybe we want to partner with maybe a university, or even sometimes some scholarships require a community service. And so you may be able to get a fellowship or an internship. AmeriCorps has a data fellow in fellowship available that you could. Now, again, if you are doing, we know fellowships and internships are not permanent, like an actual position. And so you do want to build security. You do want to think about the data that they may be privy to or have access to, and make sure that you are giving appropriate roles and responsibilities as well as access to either of these volunteer positions, semi volunteer positions. The other one is shared positions. So maybe working within your organization, or maybe a partner. Maybe you have another community partner that can't afford a full manager, but you could pull your funds together and have a shared position. That could also be an alternative. And then, of course, there's the consultant option. I know a lot of you folks use evaluators to help collect data. That's another option prior to actually creating a role and actual personnel position. And then, of course, building data competency. Um, there are different sort of strategies you can go about doing this. And really, when we think about data competency, we're not just thinking about people who just never like are dealing with all this data, but we're talking about the people who also use it on a daily basis, whether it's in planning meetings or grade band meetings. Those are all ways in which all areas and people that you want to build competency as far as data goes. It's really important whether or not they are dealing with actual PII to have people have an understanding of FERPA, because you'd be amazed at how much data teachers actually receive, how much PII data they actually receive. So keeping all staff up to date on FERPA. The other thing is, you can do data competency and training and professional development. You don't need to sort of to block out full times. You can always sort of integrate data into your regular meeting and staff or planning meetings. So starting with data maybe at the beginning, at the end of meetings. Also, you have like your regular standalone professional development as it relates to data competency training. The other great thing is, again, when we're thinking about building relationships, is if you may be having a consultant coming in and doing training, think about maybe offering that training to your potential partners. Offer them, bring them on board. Again, that's another value add piece that you can offer to a potential data partner. You really want to get to a place where the holders of the data don't feel like it's a one-way street, that you're really building a partnership, a real partnership where data and information sort of flows back and value is added to all parties. So, wow, we're coming in right on time. So really, we've gone over a lot of information, and I know it's kind of like, whoa, but I think we want to kind of get a sense about what would be your next strategic next step as it relates to data sharing for your organization. The other thing in the chat we would really like to know is that, again, we provided a overview with some digging down a little deeper in some areas, but really we just sort of scratched the surface. Data sharing and getting data, and the whole data landscape can be very complex. And so if there's something we haven't talked about, or maybe we just touched on that you would like us to dig a little deeper, we'd love to get that information. If you could jot down your thoughts in the chat, that would be really helpful. And also remember to complete this, work on this poll. So it looks like we have quite a few looking at building their data infrastructure, as well as thinking about developing their essential questions. That's great. And then, several wanting to also develop a data sharing agreement. Awesome. So now we're going to get in. We have a couple minutes for to get into some. If you have any questions, and maybe Tracy, if you've been monitoring the chat, any questions that we haven't sort of covered?
Yeah, there was one question in there about the requirements for data sharing agreement in the ARP-AIR competition.
Yeah, so I'll jump into that one. Until the ARP-AIR awards are made, we can't actually discuss any of the ARP-AIR pieces. So I can only refer you back to the notice inviting applications, but hopefully we will be able to discuss that very, very, very soon.
While we're waiting for questions, if you folks could just complete the end of event poll, just in case you have to buzz off as we're going through questions. Anyone want to get off mute and ask a question?
Well, and I do see one here as far as the agreements template. So, and Spencer, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you were referring to the agreements with like your vendors, specifically on the ACE grant.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, perfect. So I will pop a link. We did a whole webinar on those last November, but I think a lot of people have changed roles and positions since then and maybe didn't actually get to see that. And then we'd love to go into more detail with that agreement template. I will say with that one, kind of the difference between that and what we're discussing today, the one today, completely optional, just something if it's useful to you. The one that is for the service provider agreements for ACE grantees that we provided previously, there are certain specific pieces of that agreement template that must be included in the agreements that you use with your service providers. But yeah, I'll grab that webinar link for you.
Any other questions?
I also saw, do you plan on follow-up on this topic in the future? And I would say, yes, Carl, this is not a one-time topic. There's just too much there. It's too complex. There's too many pieces and parts to it. But what would be super helpful to us, particularly because the poll gives us great information, but doesn't always allow us to get down into the details, is, let us know, what parts of this would you like us to go deeper into? Do you want to hear from people in the field who've been able to successfully do data sharing? Would you like other templates or resources? Are there just certain parts of it that you'd like to dive in deeper? That's really helpful as we, think about how we're going to address that in future events too. Let's see.
I'm trying to.
Oh, and I also see, can we get the links emailed? Yes. So we will get this up. If you follow our YouTube channel, that typically is up by end of day the next day to be able to watch the recording. And then we get it up on the OESE website just as quick as possible, but we don't actually have control over uploads to that one. We have to go through EdIT. So that one typically takes at least a week to get that recording up. So depending upon how quickly you'd like to view all that, you can try one of those. And then I'll send out a little notice when that's up, because there are so many links we shared today. That way we can put them all in one spot.
Yeah. Awesome. So again, just to close out, please, again, in the chat, if you have anything you want us to dive in deeper, please put that in the chat. we'll be checking that out. Here are all of your program officer names and contact information. Also, you can email us at oie@seiservices.com if you have any questions, or again, maybe you can maybe you can't think of right now where you want to dive in, but then you're in a conversation with a potential partner and something pops in your head. You can go ahead and email us that. Also, OIE does have a Twitter account, so you want to follow at OIE Indian Ed on Twitter. They are always posting new information, resources, just not just on OIE, but around, Indian education and all different kinds of resources. A really great place to connect into. Again, I want to thank you. Thanks, Sarah, for going through all of that FERPA goodness, and Tracy for monitoring everything. Thank you guys for participating. Looks like you guys saw this as beneficial. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you later.